The battlefield was silent, but not in the way you'd expect. No explosions, no gunfire tearing through the air, no screams echoing across the trenches. And yet, an entire enemy force was retreating, convinced they were walking straight into a deadly ambush. But here's the truth no one saw coming. There were no tanks, no massive divisions waiting, no real army at all. What the enemy feared was an illusion, a ghost, and the men behind it? They would go down in history as one of the most secretive and brilliant units ever assembled during World War II. This is the story of the Ghost Army, a classified military unit that weaponized deception, creativity, and psychological warfare, and changed the course of war without pulling a trigger. By 1944, the Allied forces were pushing deeper into Nazi-occupied Europe. Victory was in sight, but it came at a brutal cost. Every mile gained meant lives lost. Every advance risked devastating counterattacks from the German military. The Allies needed something different, something unexpected. Not more firepower, but confusion, deception, fear. So they created a unit unlike anything the world had ever seen before. Officially known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, this group wasn't made up of hardened soldiers alone. Instead, it was filled with artists, designers, actors, sound engineers, even fashion illustrators. Men who, in peacetime, would have been painting canvases or designing advertisements. Now tasked with tricking an entire enemy army. Imagine being told your job in the military wasn't to fight, but to pretend, to create fake tanks, fake troops, fake radio signals, even fake generals. That's exactly what these men did. Using inflatable rubber tanks, wooden artillery, and carefully crafted props, they built entire armies out of nothing. From a distance, or even aerial reconnaissance, it looked completely real. Columns of vehicles, massive encampments, strategic positioning, everything an enemy commander would expect before a major attack. But if you walked closer, you'd realize the tanks were filled with air. The guns couldn't fire, and the soldiers were sometimes just shadows. But visuals weren't enough. War is chaotic, and the enemy relied heavily on sound. So the Ghost Army added another layer to their deception. They used powerful speakers mounted on vehicles to blast recorded sounds of real military movements. Tanks rumbling across dirt roads, bridges being constructed, troops marching in formation. These recordings were so precise, so carefully engineered, they could convince German forces that thousands of soldiers were nearby, even when there were only a few dozen. The sound could travel miles, and with it, fear spread just as far. Then came perhaps the most dangerous role of all: impersonation. Selected members of the Ghost Army were trained to act like high-ranking officers. They would move through towns, speak loudly in public, and accidentally reveal false plans, knowing enemy spies were always listening. They wore the right uniforms, used the right language, carried themselves with authority. Everything was designed to be overheard, and it worked. Time and time again, German intelligence took the bait, redirecting troops, reinforcing the wrong positions, and preparing for attacks that would never come. One of their most critical missions came near the end of the war. Allied forces were preparing a major crossing of the Rhine River, a move that could accelerate the collapse of Nazi Germany. But such an operation required secrecy. If the Germans discovered the real location of the crossing, they could concentrate their defenses and turn the river into a killing zone. So the Ghost Army stepped in. Miles away from the actual crossing point, they created a massive fake buildup. Inflatable tanks lined the riverbanks. Fake artillery pointed toward the horizon. Sound effects echoed through the night. Radio transmissions mimicked entire divisions preparing for battle. To German intelligence, it looked undeniable. This was the main attack, and they responded accordingly, moving troops to defend the wrong location. Meanwhile, the real Allied forces crossed the Rhine with far less resistance. A turning point, not won by bullets, but by belief. After the war ended, the men of the Ghost Army returned home, but they couldn't tell their story. Their missions remained classified, their achievements hidden. For decades, no one knew the truth. No headlines, no medals of fame, no recognition. It wasn't until the 1990s that the full extent of their operations began to surface. And when it did, historians were stunned. Over 20 major deception operations, thousands of lives potentially saved, an entire strategy built on illusion and executed to near perfection. What makes the Ghost Army so fascinating isn't just what they did, but how they did it. They turned creativity into a weapon. They proved that war isn't only fought with strength, but with perception. Because if you can control what your enemy believes, you control what they do next. And in war, that can be the difference between victory and defeat. Think about it. A soldier doesn't just fight what's in front of him. He fights what he thinks is in front of him. Fear magnifies threats. Uncertainty creates hesitation. And hesitation can be fatal. The Ghost Army understood this better than anyone. They didn't need to destroy the enemy. They just needed the enemy to believe destruction was inevitable. Even in modern warfare, deception remains a critical strategy. From cyber warfare to misinformation campaigns, the principles used by the Ghost Army are still evolving. The battlefield has changed, but the mind of the enemy remains the same. The illusion didn't begin as a masterpiece. It began as a risk. Because deception in war is a double-edged blade. If the enemy sees through it, the consequences aren't just failure. It's exposure. And exposure on a battlefield means death. The men of the Ghost Army knew this. They weren't hiding behind illusions. They were standing inside them. September 1944. The war in Europe had reached a critical phase. Allied forces were pushing through France, trying to dismantle German strongholds one by one. One of those strongholds was the heavily fortified port city of Brest. The Germans weren't backing down. They were dug in, armed, and ready. And the Allies needed a distraction. That's when the Ghost Army received one of its earliest real assignments, not just to practice deception, but to deploy it under real battlefield conditions. Their mission was simple on paper: convince the Germans that a large force was preparing to attack from a different direction. But nothing about it was simple. They moved into position under the cover of darkness. Inflatable tanks were unloaded silently. Rubber trucks lined up along narrow country roads. Engineers worked quickly, shaping an entire fake division out of thin air. From above, it looked convincing. From a distance, it looked terrifying. But up close, it would take only one curious scout, one wrong move, one mistake, to expose everything. The Ghost Army wasn't just creating fake tanks anymore. They were orchestrating entire narratives. Every mission had layers: visual deception, audio deception, radio deception, human deception, and every layer had to align perfectly, because if one piece felt wrong, the illusion could collapse. One of their most powerful tools was radio traffic. Operators would mimic the communication patterns of real divisions, down to the smallest details. Call signs, transmission timing, even the personalities of radio operators. German intelligence units were listening constantly, and what they heard sounded authentic. Entire phantom divisions appeared on enemy maps. Units that didn't exist were tracked, analyzed, and feared. December 1944. Winter had tightened its grip over Europe, and the war took a sudden, violent turn. The Germans launched a massive counteroffensive, what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Allied lines were shaken. Positions collapsed. Confusion spread. This wasn't a moment for illusions. This was survival. But the Ghost Army didn't retreat. They moved closer to the front, closer than ever before. Near the town of Bettembourg, Luxembourg, they were tasked with holding a section of the line, despite not being a combat unit. Let that sink in. A unit built on deception now had to face the possibility of real combat. They set up their illusions anyway. Fake artillery pointed toward the forest. Inflatable vehicles positioned as if ready to strike. Radio chatter suggested reinforcements were pouring in. To the Germans, it looked like a solid defensive force. But behind the illusion, there were barely enough men to hold a real line. Every sound mattered. Every shadow mattered. Because if the Germans attacked in full force, there would be nothing to stop them. And yet, something incredible happened. The illusion held. German units hesitated. They probed, but didn't commit fully. They believed the threat was stronger than it really was. And that hesitation bought time. Time for real reinforcements to arrive. Time for the line to stabilize. Time that may have saved countless lives. What made these missions so intense wasn't just the risk. It was the pressure. Imagine waking up every day knowing that your survival depended on the enemy continuing to believe your lie. One mistake, a misplaced prop, a wrong signal, a broken illusion, and everything could unravel. The Ghost Army soldiers had to think like artists, but also like their enemy. They had to anticipate how German commanders would interpret what they saw. What would they believe? What would they question? What would make them hesitate? It wasn't just war. It was psychology. March 1945. The war was nearing its end. But one final obstacle stood in the way of total Allied victory. The Rhine River, a natural barrier, heavily defended, a final line of resistance for Nazi Germany. Crossing it would be dangerous, possibly devastating, unless the enemy could be tricked one last time. The Ghost Army was given one of its most important missions: create the illusion of a massive crossing at a false location. Draw German forces away from the real operation, and do it convincingly enough to change the course of the final advance. They went all in. Inflatable tanks stretched across the riverbanks. Fake landing craft were assembled. Sound units blasted the chaos of preparation, bridges being built, engines revving, troops mobilizing. Radio traffic intensified. Messages hinted at imminent attack. Everything pointed to one conclusion. This was the main crossing. German forces responded. They repositioned. They reinforced the wrong sector. They prepared for a battle that would never come. And when the real crossing began, miles away, the resistance was weaker. The defenses thinner. The outcome altered. What makes these missions so powerful is this: no explosions marked their success. No dramatic charges. No iconic battlefield photos. Just quiet shifts. Delayed reactions. Wrong decisions. The Ghost Army didn't destroy enemy forces. They redirected them. And in doing so, they reshaped the battlefield itself. When the war ended, these stories didn't come out. They couldn't. The missions were classified. The details locked away. The men returned home carrying secrets that would remain buried for decades. Imagine being part of something that changed history and not being able to tell anyone. No recognition. No validation. Just silence. But history has a way of resurfacing. And when the truth finally emerged, it didn't just reveal a secret unit. It revealed a completely different way of understanding war. Not bullets. Not bombs. Not tanks. Belief. What the enemy thinks is happening. What they fear is coming. What they prepare for. The Ghost Army mastered that. They turned imagination into strategy. Illusion into survival. And deception into victory. The war didn't end with a single moment. It faded. Slowly. Cities stopped burning. Guns fell silent. And across Europe, the long shadow of World War II finally began to lift. For millions, it was the beginning of peace. For the Ghost Army, it was the beginning of silence. They didn't come home as heroes. No parades. No headlines. No medals that told the real story. Just young men stepping off ships and trains, returning to lives that had no place for what they had done. Painters went back to studios. Designers returned to advertising agencies. Writers picked up their pens again. On the surface, everything looked normal. But inside, they carried something no one else could see. Because how do you explain a war you fought without fighting? How do you describe missions where survival depended not on strength, but on whether the enemy believed your lie? They couldn't. Not to their families. Not to their friends. Not to the world. The operations were classified, locked away under layers of military secrecy. Their achievements buried in silence. For decades, the story didn't exist. History books spoke of battles, generals, and victories, but not of illusions. Not of inflatable tanks and phantom divisions. Not of soundscapes that moved armies without a single shot. And yet, the impact was real. Historians would later estimate that the Ghost Army participated in over 20 deception operations and may have saved tens of thousands of lives. Think about that. Lives not lost. Battles not fought. Blood not spilled. Because someone, somewhere, believed something that wasn't real. That's not just strategy. That's power. It wasn't until the 1990s that the veil began to lift. Documents were declassified. stories started to emerge. Veterans, now elderly, finally began to speak. And what they revealed stunned the world. This wasn't a small, experimental unit. This was a coordinated, highly strategic force that operated across Europe, using art, sound, performance, and psychology as weapons. One of the most striking parts of their story? How ordinary they were. No superhuman abilities. No elite combat training in the traditional sense. Just creativity, intelligence, and an understanding of human perception. They weren't just soldiers. They were storytellers. And the battlefield was their stage. As the truth spread, recognition slowly followed. Documentaries were made. Books were written. Historians re-examined the war through a new lens. Decades after their missions ended, the men of the Ghost Army were finally honored. In 2022, the unit was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors. A symbol of acknowledgement, of gratitude, of history finally catching up. But many of the original members weren't there to see it. Time had already taken them. And that adds a quiet weight to the story. Because their greatest victories were never celebrated when it mattered most. Because here's the truth most people don't realize. The kind of war the Ghost Army fought never ended. It evolved. Today, the battlefield looks different. No trenches, no inflatable tanks on open fields. But the principles? They're still there. Modern warfare is filled with deception, misinformation campaigns, cyber operations, psychological strategies designed to influence not just armies, but entire populations. Instead of fake tanks, there are fake narratives. Instead of sound effects on speakers, there are viral messages spreading across the internet. The tools have changed, but the objective remains the same. Control what the enemy believes, and you control what they do. The Ghost Army understood something that goes far beyond war. Reality is powerful, but perception? Perception can be stronger. If you believe something is real, your actions will follow. Your decisions will shift. Your fear will grow. Like something pulled from a movie. Invisible changes that altered the course of real events. And maybe that's why their story matters so much today. Because in a world where information moves faster than ever, where truth and illusion can blur in an instant, their legacy feels more relevant than ever before. The ending that feels like a beginning. In the end, the Ghost Army wasn't just a unit. It was an idea. That war isn't only about Ulkuwa, but about perception. That sometimes the most powerful weapon is not what you have, but what your enemy thinks you have. And that belief, fragile, invisible, uncontrollable, can shape the outcome of everything. The Ghost Army is no longer a secret, but what they taught the world. That lesson is still unfolding, and maybe it always will be.